Good evening. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and our program this evening is entitled Australia and Japan, China Counterbalance. And to help us with this discussion, we have the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Did I get that right?
You got
Mr.
it
Peter
absolutely
Jennings,
right.
Executive Director.
Thank you for having me again.
It's great to have you back, Peter, and we really appreciate you taking time from your responsibilities here in Hawaii. You know, one of the things that has been fascinating that perhaps our audience doesn't know about is, you know, and I don't want to overstate the case, but it certainly seems to me like there has been some significant history in the making that has taken place in Australia in the last several days here, and maybe you could. This has to do with Japan. Maybe you could brief our audience a little bit. What's been going on that is such a sea change?
Sure. Well, happy to talk about that. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was visiting Australia Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. On Tuesday, he became the first Japanese Prime Minister to make a speech before both houses of the Australian Parliament. And then on Wednesday, he went to our northwest to the Pilbara region, which is one of the major areas of resource extraction for iron ore and in the future of liquid natural gas exports to Japan. And on this visit, a new free trade agreement has been signed between Australia and Japan. And at the same time, a new agreement on cooperation in defence equipment and technology. It's really been a very significant visit and in many ways is lifting the Australia-Japan relationship, which has been close for decades, but lifting it to a new level, which both Prime Ministers referred to as a new strategic relationship.
Well, when it comes to strategy involving and defence matters involving Australia, I think it's helpful to maybe explain to our audience, what is it that this Australian Strategy Policy Institute is all about? And so that they have a framework of what kind of where you're coming from.
Well, my institute is a think tank based in Canberra, the capital. We're about 14 years old, and we were created by the then Australian Prime Minister John Howard, saying that he wanted to have an alternate source of policy advice available to him on defence and security issues. I have a team of about 25 people now, and we are very much focused on improving the quality of policy making and decision making in government around defence, national security, cyber security, and most recently policing matters, which we've also taken on board as one of our areas of research as well.
So one of the important aspects of this visit of Prime Minister Abe to Japan has been in the defense area, and we'll get to that later on in this program. And I think it's, you know, I noted that you have been in and out of the Australian government throughout much of your career, and one of the interesting things that I think is very fascinating is that your work in white paper advice for the Australian Ministry of Defence for its future policy and direction, and it's an unusual relationship that we don't have in this country.
Yes. Well, I mostly describe myself as a failed academic, David. I attempted to be a medieval historian until I found I wouldn't be able to pay my mortgage bills that way. So I moved into national security, and I've been in and out of the Defence Department and in various advising roles of governments for well over 25 years now. On this occasion, what you're talking about is that our government has decided to produce a new defence white paper. That's a term in Australia that we use to talk about sort of major new statements of policy And on average, in the defence world, these have happened about every 5 or 6 years ago. On this occasion, a slightly unusual tweak to the normal process is that the government established an external panel which they asked me to lead. And the role of the panel is really to sort of prod in a constructive way, we hope, the defence organisation to make sure that it's thinking creatively and innovatively about the new defence challenges which Australia and the Asia-Pacific region face. And that's all with the intent of creating a bit of creative tension, you might say. I would prefer the term creative cooperation, really, to make sure that the government's getting the best policy settings that it can in the defence field.
And so you are the chairman of this external panel that
Yes.
is leading this creative charge for the direction of Australia's future defence policy. And so this, I take it, this visit by Prime Minister Abe and the defence side of the discussions that have taken place between Australia and Japan, as well as the agreements that they have reached, are something of enormous import and interest to you.
It's very significant. It's a product of a closer relationship in the defence world, which has been building between Australia and Japan probably for about 5 or 6 years now, and in fact largely receiving bipartisan support between the parties of the left and the right in Australia. A critical moment, and Shinzo Abe refers to this in his speech to the Parliament, is when former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who was a centre-left Prime Minister, visited Japan in the weeks immediately after the Fukushima crisis, the tidal wave and the nuclear reactor breach. And in many ways, you know, the Australian Defence Force was the first foreign military that came into Japan after the crisis to provide assistance. And really from that moment on, we've seen the defence relationship get closer and closer. Within Japan itself, Abe has also been talking about, in some respects, relaxing the interpretation of the Japanese constitution, which has been very restrictive around how the Japanese self-defence force operates. And the new thing that we've seen with his visit to Canberra this week has been an agreement on defence industry cooperation, which I think opens now you know, opportunities for practical collaboration around submarine design, which for this particular defence white paper is one of the biggest decisions in front of the Australian government.
Well, let's do this, Peter. The defence side of the accords reached between Japan and Australia are very significant, and let's save those for a bit later in the program. And I think that it's important for our audience to know that what we are talking about here is really a sea change in the relationship between Australia and Japan, but it is also this particular relationship that has actually been, it's been some time in coming. But you know, it's rising to the surface now, and I think we can see all kinds of ramifications for that here in the Asia-Pacific region, and we'll talk about those later in the program as well, because here you have two middle powers that are really linking arms together, and I don't mean arms necessarily in terms of weapons,
yes,
but you know, hands, if you will.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of things that Japan and Australia can and will do together. And we'll talk about them as we get further into the program. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that has occurred that Mr. Jennings has referred to was a speech that Prime Minister Abe gave before the Australian Parliament. And Peter, I want to shift our focus now to really kind of the business side of the deal between Japan and Australia that occurred. And you talked about a free trade agreement that was executed, and this has tremendous opportunities for Australian agriculture, does it not?
Yes, there's 3 areas that our government has identified as being major growth opportunities in the relationship with Japan. One is around energy resources. And in particular, what we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years is a massive increase in the export of Australian liquid natural gas to Japan. It will probably actually lift Japan back to #1 largest Australian trading partner. Currently that's China, largely built around iron ore and coal.
Okay.
So we will see that liquid natural gas growth. Secondly, food. And thirdly, education and services. And in each of those areas, Prime Minister Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister, has said not only to Japan but also to China and other countries of Asia, you should look upon Australia as the safe, long-term provider of your energy security and your food security. And as a low-cost, high-value provider of education and other services to these countries. And I think that is really Australia's future in the region is as an energy superpower, the country which can provide stable, long-term assurance of supply to the countries of North Asia and elsewhere.
You know, I think the public here in the United States well aware of the potential for Australia's energy superpower status, and the public also aware of the superb educational opportunities that Australia affords not only domestically within the country, but many of its universities have reached out and opened offshore operations in various Asian countries that have superb reputations. The part that's most interesting in this is your comment about the food exports,
Yes.
food security. And when we are looking at Japan, essentially what you are saying is that the arrangement that Abe has made with Australia is a major change in the protectionism that Japan has previously asserted over its own rice lobby, farming lobby, and
Yes.
that this is a dawn of a new age for Japan's agricultural industry, and that their protection is going to be ended.
I think that's right. I mean, this battle is not yet completely won in terms of the Japanese agriculture lobby, particularly around rice, and I think that might well be the last of the food products that the Japanese will ultimately agree to significant external sources of supply. Australia has been a major beef supplier to Japan for a number of years now. And if I can count New Zealand is of course an independent country, but to all intents and purposes we're a single market, and New Zealand is now by far the largest dairy supplier to the Japanese market. But I think across all sources of agriculture, cereals, a wide range of refined products which are sort of finished to a high level of completion. This is now something that Australia offers, not only in terms of being able to export material, but also increasingly we find Japan and China interested in buying productive farms, buying those agricultural sources within Australia itself. That's something which has its own domestic political resonance, but it's essentially the free market at play. And they can't take the land with them. That always remains part of Australia. So there is a sort of increasing interlocking of the Australian economy, not simply in resources, but around food and North Asia. And we shouldn't forget China too, David. They're a sort of a major part of this. None of this Japanese deal is at the expense of Chinese interests in the trade and economic area. And I think China also looks to Australia as that assured long-term supply. So, for example, China recently signed a deal on liquid natural gas with the Russians, quite a few years away from delivery. But at the end of the day, the Chinese will have to make a commercial decision about which country they think is the better long-term bet for secure long-term supply. And I suspect that would be Australia.
Sure, sure, and I do too. I think one thing about the speech before we go, this is Prime Minister Abe's speech to the Australian Parliament that struck me was when he was referring to this change that was going to have to take place in Japan vis-a-vis their farming and rice lobby. He used the term that he personally was going to have to act as the drill bit to drill down and break up the what did he call it, the established roots or something like that of that industry sector.
Yes. It is an amazing speech, David, and if I could say, you know, to your viewers, you may not download many speeches from the Australian Parliament, but if there's one that you should, it's Shinzo Abe's speech to the Parliament on Tuesday. It was a remarkable speech.
What was the reaction to that?
I think very well received in the Australian media generally. What was unusual was that Prime Minister Abe actually delivered it in English. I understand it's only the third speech in his career or his time as Prime Minister that he has delivered in English. It was extremely well attuned to the Australian psyche. It touched on all of the key points of the very productive relationship that we've had with Japan since the early 1950s. It was humorous. It made a very sophisticated use of English, and it was frankly, I think, one of the best speeches that's been delivered by a foreign leader in the Australian Parliament.
Control room, let's bring up visual number 3, if we could, for audience, just as we get ready to go to a break here. Number 3, if we could. And here we have your Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, and Prime Minister Abe with their teams. And where is this?
This is in Tokyo. This was on Prime Minister Abbott's first visit to North Asia, which took place about 6 weeks ago. They were largely inking the final text of the free trade agreement, which was just signed in Canberra. Again, it was a very interesting trip. Tony Abbott went to Tokyo, Beijing and to Seoul. There was quite a bit of media commentary at the time saying that success in Tokyo would mean disaster in Beijing. It didn't happen that way. It was really a remarkably successful visit by an Australian Prime Minister, all built around strengthening the foundations for trade agreements between the three countries. But really, of all of those, the one that is most important, I think, in terms of short-term quick gain is now the free trade agreement that's been signed with the Japanese. Prime Minister Abe said in Parliament that this was a precursor to the TPP, which is really, you know, a critical thing now for all of our region. And I can only hope that the American Congress can find its way to approve this when it comes up for approval. I think early next year. And
you know, when the Japanese former Prime Minister to Abe announced that Japan was now going to join the TPP negotiations. This is back during when APEC was here in Honolulu a couple of years ago. And there were a lot of people were saying, well, that's never going to happen. You know, they'll never get over this rice farming lobby. And we can see that, I mean, we're not quite there yet, but clearly with this free trade agreement that has just been signed in Australia, that Abe believes that he is going to get that farm lobby and the rice lobby reformed in time, which is a huge stake. And hold your thought, because we're going to go to a commercial break here. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and we have with us as a special guest Mr. Peter Jennings of the Australian Strategy Policy Institute from Canberra. We'll be back after the break.
Okay, this is ThinkTech, and one of our favorite shows is Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. And it goes 4 to 5 every Wednesday right here from ThinkTech in Pioneer Plaza at the core of downtown Honolulu. And my co-host is Ray Starling from Hawaii Energy. Ray, do you like the show?
I love the show. It's great to see all the new people coming in with new ideas about how to save energy, get us off of fossil fuel, and that's what it's all about. So Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. See us on Wednesday afternoons at 4 o'clock.
I knew he'd say that. Thanks, Ray.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and we're talking about Australia and Japan, China counterweights or counterbalance. And our special guest is Mr. Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute from Canberra. And Peter, let's go back to this very, I think, in all fairness, heartwarming speech that Prime Minister Abe has just delivered to the Australian Parliament. I want to read you something that he said and kind of get your reaction to it. Yep. And you know, right before the break, we were talking about the TPP and the whole business trade aspect of this visit and the inking of the new accords between Japan and Australia. So let me read you this. And you say it was Prime Minister Abe is delivering the speech in English, to the Australian Parliament, and I'm sure he made a few little slip-ups. As what did you say? It was his fifth or third time he'd ever given a I have to give him. I mean, how would you and I like to give a speech in Japanese? You know,
I would be struggling, David.
We really
don't know about you. Yeah.
Take a lot of practice. Okay, so here's what he says to the Australian Parliament. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, opening up Japan's economy and society is one of the major engines for my growth strategy. I am now working to reform systems and norms that have not changed in many decades. Japan will grow by increasing its productivity while keeping good fiscal discipline. To that, I will become like a drill bit myself, breaking through the vested interests and the norms that have deep roots. Reforms are now starting in the fields of agriculture, energy policy, and medicine. For the first time in decades, we have also started to reform old norms in our labor relations. Since the beginning, I have stressed that I want to make Japan a place where women shine. I have also said time and again that for non-Japanese with a can-do spirit and ability, Japan and Japanese society must be a beacon of hope." Amazing. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it is a remarkable speech, and I think what it says to me, I guess we've seen this for a year or two now, is that Japan is significantly changing under Abe's rule. You know, we have spent the last 10 years, I think, being used to a Japanese system that just didn't look as though it was
dysfunctional. Come on, it was dysfunctional. It had a revolving door leadership.
Yeah,
and
we had a prime minister about every 12 months. We had ministers moving even faster than that. There was even, I think if you visited Tokyo, a sense of despondency in the place, that they just couldn't get out of their economic malaise. Abe has changed that, and certainly I've observed in my visits to Tokyo now, the bureaucracy is quite galvanised. You know, they have a sense that they can actually achieve some of the change that they know they need to achieve.
He's putting some fire to that country, isn't he?
He is. And, you know, I don't think it's just my ear that you hear almost some of the tone of Kennedy in some of those phrases that where he talks about Japan becoming a beacon of hope. I mean, imagine any earlier Japanese prime minister using that phrase. So, you know, one really has to hope now that Abe will be able to carry the country with him. I mean, he has the Diet, you know, largely aligned in terms of political support. I think the bureaucracy also senses that there's a real opportunity here. I think there's a real momentum in the place, which is a major positive.
Let's shift, Peter, to the whole aspect of the recent accords between Japan and Australia, to the defense side now, because the whole business trade side is any way that you put it, is a total wow. And maybe the easiest way to do this is I want to do two things here. So let me talk to my senior engineer first here in the control room. Could we put up visual number 5 for our audience if we could? Okay, so here we have a Japanese submarine. Mm-hmm. All right, and then Peter, I want to read to you another quote from Prime Minister Abe's speech to the Australian Parliament. And this has to do with security and military and defense, and this is in your bailiwick. Mm-hmm. So he says to the Australian Parliament, "Today I stand in front of you who represent the people of Australia and solemnly that pledge that now Japan and Australia will finally use our relationship of trust, which has stood up through the trials of history in our cooperation in the area of security. Australia and Japan have now freed ourselves from one old layer and are now moving towards a new special relationship. Prime Minister Abe and I confirmed that already on 7 April in Tokyo. Today, Prime Minister Abe and I will sign an agreement concerning the transfer of defense equipment and technology that will make the first cut in engraving the special relationship in our future history." What is he saying? And I realize I didn't read that very smoothly, and so I apologize to Prime Minister Abe, his staff, his speechwriters, but you get the point.
Well, he is pointing to as a decision which lifts the defence relationship to a much more substantial level. And really behind this has been a decision taken domestically in Japan to revise the very strict interpretation which they've had on Article 9 of their constitution, limiting the role of the self-defence force. Abe's reinterpretation of that now gives the self-defence force the capacity to assist allies should they come under threat. And I would give you one example of that. Australian and Japanese forces actually worked together in Iraq in the south of the country after the 2003 invasion. Our forces were there because under the terms of the Japanese constitution, that self-defence force element in Iraq would not have been allowed to protect itself if it came under fire. Now, that's what the Australians were there to do. The reinterpretation of the Japanese constitution makes it possible now for the self-defence force to, for example, assist the US forces if North Korea fires a missile over Japan aimed at the United States. I think with that we now have the opportunity to look more closely at building defence relations between Australia and Japan. In particular, I think in the area of technology, Japan has now signed defence technology agreements with 2 other countries, that's the UK and the United States. And it's going to make it possible for us to talk to Japan about whether or not, for example, we could use some aspects of their submarine technology. Japanese have very sophisticated, conventionally powered submarines. And we are interested in discussing with the Japanese whether or not we could actually use that submarine design, or at least the engine design, for our own replacement submarine program, which is the biggest financial decision that will have to be taken in the next Defence White Paper.
So this is an area that you're working on, and the Japanese technology that Australia is interested in is a conventional propulsion, but super quiet technology.
Super quiet technology. In our existing submarines and in future submarines, we will undoubtedly be using American weapon systems and sensors. But in a sense, that is, once one gets over the political aspects of doing these things, it's a relatively manageable technical ask to marry a US weapon system into a Japanese hull. And I think that will become part of what we're now going to talk to the Japanese about.
So there's a technology aspect to this arrangement.
Yes.
And then there's an equipment aspect. What is that? Is that just in submarines? Is Australia going to buy submarines from Tokyo?
I think that's one possibility. Another one that the government is considering is an indigenous Australian design. pretty high risk if the government goes down that track. And there are very few other countries, the French, the Swedes, the Germans, that might have similar technology of interest to us in the submarine field. In fact, it really is only the Japanese which are making a submarine of the size and of the relative capacity to go long distances which meet Australia's requirements. So I think the submarine will certainly be very high on our list of things that we're interested in talking to the Japanese about.
Is this deal between Japan and Australia, is it on defense equipment, is it limited to submarine?
No, it's not. I think there is the potential for us to move into other areas as well. So, for example, both Japan and Australia and the US will operate joint strike fighters. And one of the potentials that will exist as a result of that commonality is that we could look at training in Australia for the joint strike fighter fleet of a number of countries. Australia has the space, it has the land, the ranges where you can actually fly aircraft of that nature into very sophisticated ranges where you can drop weapons and identify, you know, the skills, or increase the skills of your pilots. Japan simply does not have access to those ranges within its own domestic space. So I think there are some opportunities there, and certainly we're already cooperating quite closely with the Japanese on things like maritime surveillance. Another area which I think will come to the fore as a result of this agreement is cooperation with land forces, with armies. And so we're now looking really for the first time ever at the possibility of the Japanese self-defense force land training on Australian soil. That would be seen to be a relatively normal thing for an army to do, but for the Japanese this is quite a big step in terms of their, you know, post-war thinking about how they work with other countries.
You know, when we come back after the break, ladies and gentlemen, one of the questions that we want to find out from Mr. Jennings is whether this or these recent agreements and accords between Australia and Japan this week really set Japan up as a counterbalance to Australia's relationship with China. And you are watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm David Day, and our program, Australia and Japan, China Counterbalance. And we'll see you on the other side of the break. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard, and I host the show Center Stage on the ThinkTech Hawaii digital series right here every Wednesday from 2 to 3 Hawaii time. I would really love to have you watch the show and see what we do here. I talk with some of the most amazing people, artists, most of them, all of them involved in some sort of artistic process. And our goal here on the show is to dig into that artistic process, and you would not believe what some people say, what some people do, what people go through to express. And these are people who have to express somehow, and I find that infinitely interesting. Not only that they have to express, but how they end up doing it. I really hope that you will watch the show and enjoy talking with some of these people the same way that I do. Thanks, and I hope to see you soon on Center Stage on the ThinkTech Hawaii digital series, Wednesdays from 2 to 3. See you soon.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. Our program this evening, Australia and Japan, China Counterbalance. And if you just tuned in, that's precisely what we want to find out about from Mr. Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategy Policy Institute, visiting here in Hawaii from Canberra. We've been talking throughout this program about really a historic series of agreements that have just taken place in Australia, culminated in Australia. I mean, there's a history before that, but having to do on the business agreement, a free trade agreement between Australia and Japan, and on the defense side, both technology and equipment pieces. And so if we go back, Peter, to kind of the perspective of a famous geopolitical foreign policy strategist in Australia, Professor Hugh White. And for you ladies and gentlemen that don't know, Peter, correct me if I'm off base here, but Professor White has written some very controversial pieces and saying that you know, maybe it's not in Australia's self-interest to be so closely aligned with the U.S. when its business dealings were so heavily tied to Australia. Now, you got to help me with this because
yes.
you know, that's your guys, not mine. But
well, that's Hugh White's argument. Is he's written a book called The China Choice, and the choice he refers to is a choice that he says Australia at some stage will have to make between favouring China as its closest or as its largest economic market, or the United States as its most important military ally.
okay, so now with that perspective,
Yep.
what does this whole Japan deal do to that? Does that provide a economic business market counterbalance to China, or no?
It provides, the way I would describe it, another arrow in Australia's quiver of key relationships around the region. And you know, there's no question that some in China will be quite sensitive, particularly about the military cooperation which emerges from Prime Minister Abe's visit. But you know, I would have to say, you know, we also have a surprisingly close defence relationship with the Chinese. When I was in the Defence Department, I actually ran a number of senior annual dialogues that we had at the top levels with the Chinese military. I recall one of my Chinese counterparts saying to me at one of these, you know, Peter, the only country we have a closer relationship with apart from Australia on defence is Pakistan, which I thought told you something interesting both about China and about Pakistan. But you know, none of this should be seen as in any way targeting China, and in fact Abe's language and Prime Minister Abbott's language was very careful to say that this is about, you know, building a sense of security in the region. That, you know, there are many countries in the region that feel secure because of the US presence in the Asia Pacific. They feel secure because they're able to cooperate with each other. And I think that's going to become more of a feature of what we see, these kind of strengthening relations. We will aim at building closer ties with China as well. And we would want to persuade the Chinese that, you know, nothing that's happened with Abe's visit is directed against them. It is all about building that sense of regional stability and confidence. You know, to go back to my friend Hugh White's line, you know, I just don't buy it. Australia doesn't have to choose. What we need to do is to maintain good relations both with the US and with China. And I think increasingly Japan now plays in as almost the third leg of that stool. You know, if the economic projections are right, Japan will be probably our first largest market again because of liquid natural gas in a few years.
So it will actually displace China as the number one foreign market.
That seems to be where the trajectory is heading, because Chinese demand for Australian iron ore is sort of slowly reducing, and Japanese demand for Australian liquid natural gas is massively increasing. And so we may see a switch between China, which is currently number one, and Japan. And so I would put this in the context of saying it's not about choice, it's actually about a country sensibly balancing its interests, economics and security with the regional great powers. I think that's where Australia's heading.
Let's focus now on a slightly different topic, and that is the agreements reached between Australia and Japan this week. I think any fair assessment, independent observer would say, okay, we now have two middle powers that, by virtue of a free trade agreement and defense, are effectively, you know, linking. Holding hands or linking arms, if you will. And so we were strengthening these two middle powers in our region. And rather than providing a counterbalance, I'd like you to think about the possibility that what has happened this week is the opportunity for these two middle powers to serve as powerful and effective mediators or super diplomats, if you will, for disputes in the region. And think about that, and then I want to read you a quote from Prime Minister Abe's speech, and I don't know whether that's where he's going or not, but irrespective of whether or not he's going there, then I want to get your reaction to this possibility of Australia and Japan strengthening their role as potential mediators, as middle powers, so that this deal is very very important from a diplomacy standpoint as we look to the years in the future. Prime Minister Abe to the Australian Parliament. I quote, and hopefully I can read it a little smoother this time. There are many things Japan and Australia can do together by each of us joining hands with the United States, an ally for both of our nations. Japan is now working to change its legal basis for security so that we can act jointly with other countries in as many ways as possible. And you've talked about that. We want to make Japan a country that will work to build an international order that upholds the rule of law. Our desire is to make Japan a country that is all the more willing to contribute to peace in the region and beyond. It is for this reason that Japan has raised the banner of active contribution to peace. Whatever we decide to do, I will tell you that Japan will continue to work together with our neighbor at the longitude of 135 degrees east. That's Australia. That's why we have made this special relationship.
Yeah.
Reaction?
Well, you know, David, you talk about middle powers, and you know, I think to myself, there are now about 180 countries in the United Nations. You might say a middle power is someone that occupies perhaps that 90 to 110 percentile, something like that. Whereas, in fact, you know, Australia is, I think, number 12 in terms of the size of its global economy.
Right.
We are, I think, about the 15th largest defence spender, and Japan is, of course, significantly bigger than that. So really, we're actually more than middle powers. We're kind of like the consequential powers of the Asia-Pacific region, if you put to one side the US. And I think that a working, trusting strategic relationship between these two countries has the potential to become a really formative part of the stability of the Asia-Pacific. In many ways, you know, neither Australia nor Japan are really threatening to their neighbours. They have no designs on their neighbours' territory. The Japanese Self-Defence Force is one of the most tightly controlled organisations, really more built for purely defensive roles. Sure. And the same is true of the Australian Defence Force. And I think amongst those neighbours, there is a great deal of trust for their interest in working with us. So I think there's quite a strong possibility now that Australia and Japan can be the sort of regional drivers of stability. The big question that remains is, can we bring China into this partnership sooner or later? You know, will China ultimately decide that its strategic interest rests in sort of working with the region rather than trying to carve out a role for itself separate to the interests of the region? And that, you know, the jury is still out on that. We have to see how China evolves over the next decade, I would guess.
Okay. I want to ask you about some other developments in the region, but let's do that after a short break. And ladies and gentlemen, you are watching ThinkTech Asia, and I'm your host, David Day. We've got Peter Jennings of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute with us, and we're going to hold on to him for some interesting questions vis-a-vis Indonesia when we come back, Australia's neighbor. Stay with us.
Aloha, my name is Willow Chang Alion, and I host a show called The Art of Life. We air live every Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. And what we do is basically we focus on individuals who create a unique sense of place for Hawaii. These are movers and shakers, artists, innovators. They are also traditionalists. They're all involved in the archival process, and they make this place a unique place, one that makes Hawaii a richer place to be. I hope you do join us, and certainly tell your friends about the show, whether they live here or they live abroad. It's a way to give back to our community. We're keeping it Pono.
We're back. You're watching Australia and Japan, China Counterbalance, and our special guest is Mr. Peter Jennings of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. My apologies. Peter is the executive director of that organization, and we've been talking about a enormously significant series of agreements between Japan and Australia that have occurred this week. Peter, let me turn now to an election that has just occurred in Indonesia. Control room, if we would start with visual number 6 there. This is between Joko Widodo and Prabowo Subianto, two candidates. The results are being counted as this program is being broadcast. How do you see this?
I think the first thing to say, David, is we've seen a largely peaceful election in Indonesia. And that's really in itself quite a magnificent thing for a country that only 15 years ago was, to all intents and purposes, a dictatorship. It has, there are around 500,000 voting booths in the country.
Incredible.
And they've been able to deliver a stable and, I think, what will be demonstrated to be free and fair election. It looks as though we have a pretty close result between the two presidential candidates, with Widodo at the moment looking like he's the fellow that's going to come out ahead, possibly 54% of the vote, something like that.
So let's go back to visual number 8 if we can, or this is fine, this one. This is Joko, the current mayor of Jakarta, and this is the gentleman that what you're saying looks like he's in the lead and may well become the next president of Indonesia. Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. It is the fourth largest country in the world by population, and it is right next door to Australia. Ramifications of this election on relationship with Indonesia, what do you see?
Well, we've had, it's fair to say, a slightly problematic relationship over history, broadly good, but almost every 10 years or so some problem which creates a bit of friction between the two countries. Most recently that's been around the issue of illegal people movements coming by boat. Not Indonesians, mostly people from the Middle East or Sri Lanka actually, but going to Indonesia to then come down to Australia. That's a problem which seems largely to have now been resolved by the Australian government.
Yeah, I wish our government had resolved our illegal immigration situation. But
your task is, of course, a much more challenging one than us, but it was a difficult one. I think our government has now largely dealt with it. That does clear the ground for a warmer and more positive relationship to exist between Canberra and Indonesia. I think that's more likely what will happen if Jokowi, as he's known, wins the election. This is a fellow who has a practical can-do attitude, who engages with the population, makes visits out to local communities to see what their problems are, has done his best to eliminate or reduce corruption, which has been an endemic problem in the Indonesian system. And I think the impression is he'll be a pragmatist that the Australian government and the US government will be able to work with very effectively.
What if the election goes the other way?
Well, his alternate candidate is Prabowo, and a person who in some respects is more hailing back to the military past of Indonesia.
Control room, there we go.
Yeah, I mean, you see this photo here. This was at an election rally in Jakarta of several months ago now, where Prabowo was sort of going back to his military past as a previous commander of the Special Forces and of the Strategic Reserve around Jakarta. He's a person that has a fairly shady human rights record. both as a young military officer in East Timor in the early 1970s right up to the 1998 riots in Jakarta. He would be a difficulty, I think, both for Australia and for the US if he was elected. He's a person who is clearly pointing back to a sort of Sukarnoist past of strong authoritarian control. At this stage, it looks as though he's just not quite made the votes that he needs to win the election.
Let me show you, as we end this show, visual number 12, if we could. And I will represent to you, these are photos of both candidates that were taken at separate times. They were called to the current president, SBY's private residence. And what is the purpose of him calling these candidates there? Do you know?
I think it was probably a case of saying to them, now let's not allow domestic politics to, disrupt really what is a very positive situation for Indonesia internationally. SBY has been a great friend of Australia. He's visited our country many times. He's a much admired and respected person in the Australian context, and he's always helped to sort of smooth down any populist antagonism between the two countries. I think he's providing a bit of counsel, sort of senior mentoring to his two candidates to say, whatever you guys do, let's not disrupt the positive path that Indonesia is on. And it's a path of moderation, economic growth, tackling corruption. I mean, these are the things that if Indonesia gets it right, it will make it the Southeast Asian powerhouse in the coming decade. I think in some ways this is going to be a threshold choice for the Indonesians. If they go for Jokowi, as it seems as though they have, we may see a continuity and indeed an improvement. Prabowo would be more a hail back to the Sukarno past, the Suharto past.
Much more problematic.
Much more problematic.
You know, Peter, on behalf of ThinkTech, I'd like to thank you for joining us again. We hope that we have the privilege of having you join us on our show in the future. And ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching ThinkTech Asia. Our special guest has been Mr. Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. I'm your host, David Day, and we wish you a safe drive home. Good night.